Sarah stood there, her eyes searching mine as if hoping for something, a sign, an answer, anything that might tell her we could start over. But I couldn't give her that. Not anymore. I had been standing on the precipice of uncertainty for too long, watching as the ground beneath me slowly crumbled away. Her words, however sincere they seemed, no longer held the weight they once did. They had been diluted by too many unsaid things, too many years of subtle betrayals, and the echo of a love that had faltered long before that fateful kiss. "I don't expect forgiveness," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I need you to understand, this wasn't about him, not really. It was about me, about what I've become, what I've lost." I stared at her, unable to respond, my thoughts swirling. I wanted to ask her why. Why hadn't she come to me before, when things started to fall apart? Why hadn't we faced it together, instead of letting silence stretch between us until it became a wall too high to climb? But the questions would have been pointless. She had already made her choice, just as I had made mine. There was no going back now. "I understand," I said finally, my voice distant, as though I were speaking to a stranger. "But that doesn't change anything." Her face fell, her shoulders sagging with the weight of my words. I wasn't being cruel, but I had learned that cruelty often comes from a place of deep hurt. The hurt of being betrayed by the person you trusted the most, the one you thought you knew better than anyone, the hurt of seeing the truth unravel in front of you, piece by painful piece. "I never wanted to hurt you," she continued, her voice barely audible. "But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I lost us. There it was, the truth, or at least part of it. But it wasn't enough anymore. The trust was gone. The foundation of everything we had built together had cracked, and no amount of remorse could fix it." "You're right," I said, my voice growing firmer. "You lost us. And I let you. I thought I could fix things, thought we could fix things. But now, I don't think we can." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But she didn't. Instead, she turned away from me, her hand reaching for the door handle as if preparing to leave, as though she had finally realized what was inevitable: the end. Before she could open the door, I called her name, just one last time. "Sarah." She froze, not turning around, but she waited. I wasn't sure what I expected to say. There were no more grand gestures, no more heartfelt pleas. Just a simple truth. "I loved you, but I don't recognize you anymore, and I don't think I can love the person you've become." She let out a shaky breath, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she finally turned to face me. "I know. I don't know who I am anymore either." And with that, she walked out of the door, leaving me standing in the silence of our broken home, the weight of finality settling around me like dust. It wasn't the kiss that had destroyed us. It was the slow fade, the quiet erosion of everything we once were. She had been searching for something I couldn't provide, and in the end she had found it, even if it was only a brief moment of escape. But now, as the door closed behind her, I was left with the empty space she had vacated. Space between us that could never be filled again. It would take time, but I would heal. I would rebuild, piece by piece. Not just from the loss of her, but from the realization that I had allowed myself to stay in a place where I wasn't truly seen, truly known. I had stayed, thinking love was enough, when in truth it was only part of what we needed. Now, as I walked through the quiet house, the echo of her absence ringing in every room, I understood that I was no longer the man I was before that night, and neither was she. But I had to move forward, had to find a way to rebuild my life from the ground up. Because in the end, the only thing we have is ourselves, and that, as it turns out, might just be enough. The days that followed Sarah's departure were a blur, more a slow unraveling than anything else. The house felt quieter, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that magnified every thought, every regret, every moment I had ignored, while I tried to pretend that everything would be okay. I spent the first few days in a haze, wandering from room to room, feeling like I was living someone else's life. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was consumed by the weight of our history, the years of shared moments that now felt like they belonged to a different version of me, one who had been too trusting, too hopeful. And yet, in the midst of all the grief, there was a strange sense of relief, a feeling that despite everything, something inside me was beginning to clear. No more lies, no more pretenses, no more holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. But healing isn't a straight line. There were nights when I would sit in the dim light of the kitchen, the silence too loud, and think about what Sarah was doing now. Was she happy? Was she regretting her decisions? Was she feeling the emptiness that I felt? I knew the answers didn't matter. What mattered was the choice I had made, the one to let her go, even if it felt like I was tearing apart at the seams. It wasn't, until I found myself walking through a park aimlessly in the early hours of one morning that something shifted. The trees, still dark with the last remnants of night, whispered as the wind blew through them. The world around me was moving, even when I was standing still. And in that stillness, I realized something important. I couldn't keep living in the past. I couldn't keep grieving a life that was no longer mine to have. I had to move on, rebuild not just for the future, but because I deserved it. The first step came when I decided to clear the remnants of Sarah from the house. I boxed up her clothes, her things, the small tokens we had exchanged over the years. Each item felt like a weight being lifted off my shoulders, but it also felt like the closing of a door I had long been reluctant to shut. I didn't burn the memories. No, they would always be a part of me. But I put them away, tucked safely, into the attic where I didn't have to see them every day. I needed space to breathe, space to figure out who I was now. As the weeks passed, I began to find pieces of myself I had forgotten. I reconnected with friends I had pushed away, letting go of the isolation that had crept in during those final months of our marriage. I started running again, something I hadn't done since before Sarah and I had met. The rhythm of my feet on the pavement, the steady pulse of my heartbeat. It was a reminder that I could still feel alive, that I still had control over my life. Even found myself reaching out to people who had once been a part of my world, but had faded as my relationship with Sarah deepened. There was a sense of freedom in reconnecting, in talking without the weight of past secrets hovering over me. I started to realize that I wasn't defined by the woman I had once loved, nor by the mistakes I had made. One day, a few months later, I ran into an old acquaintance, Mia. We had met years ago at a conference, and after a brief conversation, we realized we had more in common than we had initially thought. She was funny, smart, and kind. Everything I hadn't realized I'd missed in the years with Sarah. There was something about her presence that felt familiar, but not in the way I had felt with Sarah. It was different, fresh. I wasn't ready to jump into anything new, but I could feel the possibility of something starting to take shape. Mia didn't ask questions about my past, and I didn't volunteer anything. We simply spent time together, enjoying the simple moments, the way life could be when you weren't trapped in the past. The truth was, I wasn't ready to fully open up to anyone, but I was beginning to think that maybe there was room for me to love again. Not in the way I had with Sarah, not in a way that was driven by need or insecurity, but in a way that was rooted in choice, in mutual respect, and in the joy of discovering someone for who they truly were. And yet, despite all the newness, the small moments of joy, there were still times when Sarah's face would flash in my mind, and I would wonder how she was living with the decisions she had made.
Did she miss me?
Was she happier now? Or had the kiss and everything that followed haunted her as much as it haunted me? I didn't know the answers, and I realized I didn't need to. What mattered now was what I was doing with my life, the way I was rebuilding it. I had been broken once, but I was learning how to pick up the pieces and put them together in a way that was mine. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. So I kept moving forward, one step at a time. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because life, in all its messy, unpredictable glory, was waiting. As the days turned into weeks, I found a rhythm I hadn't expected to find so soon after everything had fallen apart. I was learning how to exist outside of Sarah's shadow, outside of the life we had once built together. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The past wasn't a burden anymore. It was simply a part of who I had been, and that made it easier to let go of. Mia and I continued to spend time together, the connection between us growing slowly, naturally. It wasn't like the explosive passion I had once felt with Sarah, but there was something more enduring about it. With Mia, there were no expectations, no weight of history pulling us in different directions. We could just be. We could laugh about small things, share our thoughts without the heaviness of guilt or regret. And yet, despite the comfort I was beginning to find with Mia, there were still moments when the ache of my past would creep in, when I would lie, awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choices. I hadn't spoken to Sarah since the day she left, but I found myself thinking about her occasionally. There was no anger anymore, no resentment, just a quiet understanding that the love we had once shared was no longer enough to hold us together. We had both grown into people who were no longer a match for each other, no matter how much we might have tried to convince ourselves otherwise. One evening, as I was out for a run, I found myself passing the old coffee shop Sarah and I used to frequent. The one with the small window seat where we would sit for hours talking about everything and nothing at all. I didn't go in, but I paused outside for a moment, letting the memories flood over me. It was strange how something that had once been so comforting could now feel like a distant, faded dream. I had loved that version of Sarah, the one who was carefree and spontaneous, but I realized that version of her was gone, just as I was no longer the person I had been back then. I didn't need closure anymore. I had it. The truth was, Sarah and I had been drifting apart long before the kiss, long before the lies. Our love had been a beautiful thing, but it had run its course, and the only thing left to do was to let it go. As I walked back to my apartment, my heart a little lighter than it had been in months, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living again. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer consumed me. It was a part of who I was, but it wasn't all of who I was. Mia had become a steady presence in my life, someone who I could trust, someone who could make me laugh when the weight of the past threatened to pull me back down. There was still hesitation between us. Neither of us was ready to dive headfirst into something new, not with all the emotional baggage we carried, but there was potential. There was hope. One night, as we sat on my couch watching an old movie and sipping wine, Mia turned to me with a soft smile. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if things had worked out differently?" she asked quietly. I looked at her, the warmth of the moment enveloping me, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to be completely present. "I used to," I admitted, my voice steady but tinged with something deeper. "But I don't. Anymore. I can't change the past. All I can do is move forward. And maybe this is where I'm supposed to be." Mia's eyes softened, and she reached out to gently touch my hand. "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're here." I squeezed her hand, and in that simple gesture, something shifted. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a step in that direction. It was the kind of step that said, I'm open to this. I'm open to what comes next. We didn't need to rush things. There was no timeline we had to follow, no script to adhere to. We were both carrying our own histories, but we were also learning to create a future. Together or apart, we didn't know yet. What mattered was that, for the first time in months, I wasn't haunted by the past. I was just living. And in that moment, I realized that the most important thing wasn't finding someone new to fill the space Sarah had left. It was learning how to fill that space for myself, to reclaim my life, my happiness, my future. Whatever came next, I knew was ready for it. The weeks rolled on, and the changes in my life were subtle but undeniable. I had reclaimed my independence, my sense of self, and for the first time in a long while, I was truly beginning to enjoy the solitude. It wasn't the lonely kind of solitude I had felt after Sarah left, but a space I had carved out for myself, a space where I could breathe, reflect, and understand the person I had become. Mia and I continued to spend time together, but I never rushed things. There was an unspoken agreement between us. We would let whatever was meant to happen unfold naturally. We took pleasure in the simple acts of companionship, long walks through the city, dinners at small, cozy restaurants, and quiet nights spent talking about our pasts, our dreams, and everything in between. There was no pressure, no urgency, just the gentle unfolding of something new. But as the connection between Mia and me deepened, so did my understanding of the fragile nature of relationships. Every so often I found myself recalling the moment Sarah had kissed someone else. I wondered if it had been a turning point for her, or if it had been the culmination of something that had been unraveling for years. It was easy to see it as the moment everything fell apart, but the truth was that the cracks had been there long before. The kiss was just a symptom of a much deeper issue that neither of us had been brave enough to address. I realized that while Sarah's betrayal had been a blow, it had also been a catalyst for my own growth. I couldn't blame her for what had happened, nor could I continue to carry the weight of the past. The truth was, I had been afraid to let go, afraid to face the unknown. But in letting go of her, I had found the courage to face the future on my own terms. And then came the moment when everything changed. One afternoon, while I was at work, I received an unexpected message from Sarah. It had been months since we'd spoken, and I wasn't sure what prompted her to reach out. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen, wondering what this meant. "Can we talk?" the message read. "I need to explain something." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward without looking back. But there was a small part of me, still carrying that old hope, that wanted to hear what she had to say. I took a deep breath and typed a response. "What do you need to explain?" She replied almost immediately. "I owe you an explanation. Please meet me. I can't do this over text." I didn't want to meet her. I didn't want to reopen old wounds, especially when I was finally finding peace. But curiosity gnawed at me, and I found myself agreeing to meet her at a cafe we had frequented in the past. It wasn't the easiest choice, but it was a choice I needed to make for my own closure. When I arrived, Sarah was already there, sitting by the window, her back to the light. She looked different. The confidence I had once admired seemed to have faded, replaced by something more vulnerable. It was almost as if time had aged her in a way that I hadn't expected. Maybe it was the weight of the choices she had made, the consequences she had faced. I took a seat across from her, the air thick with unspoken words. Neither of us said anything for a moment, and it felt like we were two strangers who had once shared everything but had nothing left to say. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since she'd walked out of the house months ago. Not just for what happened with the kiss, but for everything that led up to it. I wasn't honest with you, and I wasn't honest with myself. I listened, though I didn't know what I was expecting from her. I wasn't angry anymore, not with her, not with anyone. I had learned to let go of the bitterness. But as she spoke, something inside me tightened. I was afraid, she continued, her voice wavering. Afraid of losing myself, of losing everything I thought I wanted. And in the process, I lost you. I lost us. Her words stung, but they didn't break me. They didn't change the fact that I had already moved on, already accepted the reality of our separation. But part of me, just a small part, wanted to hear the rest. To understand her side, even if it didn't change anything. I thought, she said softly, that the kiss would make everything clear, that it would be a wake-up call, something that would fix everything. But all it did was make everything worse. I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words sink in. It was almost too little, too late. Why now? I finally asked. Why are you telling me this now? Because I've been trying to make sense of everything, she replied, her voice trembling. And I've realized that the person I was when I left, that wasn't me. I've spent months trying to figure out who I am without you, without us, but I never stopped thinking about what we had. I didn't know how to fix it. The days after that meeting felt like a strange kind of rebirth. There was no closure in the conventional sense, no dramatic reconciliation, no final apology that would make everything right. But in a way, it was better this way. We had said what needed to be said, and now the only thing left was to let it go and continue our separate journeys. As I walked away from the cafe that afternoon, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a moment of triumph or vindication, but something more subtle, a sense of freedom, of release. I had spent so long trying to piece together the shattered fragments of my past, trying to make sense of the things that had gone wrong. But now, I realized that there was nothing left to fix. The past was behind me, and all I had was the present, the future, my future. I threw myself into my work, into the things that brought me joy without any ties to anyone else. I spent weekends exploring new places in the city, rediscovering old hobbies that had been pushed aside. I began to spend more time with Mia, but there was no rush, no expectation that things had to move in any particular direction. We were both content in the space we had carved out together, a space where we didn't have to explain our histories, just our hopes for what lay ahead. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of doubt, moments when I would catch myself wondering if I was making the right choices, if I was truly ready to let someone else in. But Mia had a way of calming those fears, of making me feel like everything would be okay, even if we didn't know what okay looked like yet. And then one evening, as we sat on the roof of my apartment building, watching the city lights flicker like fireflies below us, Mia turned to me with a softness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. You know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I never thought I'd find myself in this place. After everything that's happened, I thought I'd be done with relationships for good. But with you, I don't know. I feel different. Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment I wasn't sure what to say. The vulnerability in her voice mirrored my own, and I realized that I had been holding back too, afraid of repeating the past, of being hurt again. But sitting there with her, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, I realized something important. I didn't have to rush. We didn't have to have all the answers right now. I feel the same way, I said softly, looking out at the skyline. But I think that's okay. We don't need to have it all figured out. Mia smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. Yeah, I think you're right. And in that moment, something in me clicked. The past, with all its baggage, no longer held the power to define me. Sarah's kiss, the betrayal, the heartbreak, It was all a part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. I had learned, through the pain and the confusion, that the only thing that truly mattered was how I chose to move forward. So I decided to take that step, one small, careful step at a time. There was no rush, no need for grand declarations, or promises I wasn't ready to make. Just the quiet, steady knowledge that I had the power to shape my own future. Mia and I continued to build our connection slowly, letting it grow naturally without forcing anything. We both understood that our pasts had shaped us, but they didn't have to control us. We could be whoever we wanted to be in this moment, without the weight of old mistakes dragging us down. As the months went by, I found myself becoming more and more at peace with my life. The scars from the past were still there, but they were no longer painful. They were reminders of the strength it had taken to move forward, of the lessons I had learned along the way, and through it all, Mia remained by my side, not as a replacement for what I had lost, but as a companion on a new journey, one where I didn't need to be perfect, one where the past was a stepping stone, not a prison. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what it might hold. Time, like a slow, steady river, continued to move forward, and with it I found myself settling into a life that felt both familiar and new. Mia and I, while not rushing toward anything, had woven a comfortable routine together. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations, but rather a quiet understanding that we were content in each other's presence, exploring a partnership built on trust, patience, and the recognition that neither of us was perfect, but we could still find peace in the mess. I still thought about Sarah sometimes, not with the same intensity I had when everything was fresh, but more like a passing memory. She had been a significant part of my life, and the hurt she caused had shaped the person I was becoming. But it didn't define me anymore. It was simply one chapter of many in the book of my life. And while I might never fully understand her choices, I had come to realize that it wasn't up to me to make sense of them. I had my own journey to navigate. One afternoon, while Mia and I were taking a walk in the park, I noticed something had shifted within me. I was no longer haunted by the lingering questions about Sarah, whether or not I was the one who had failed, whether or not I could have done more. Those questions had become irrelevant. It was as though I had reached a point where I understood that the only thing I could control was how I chose to move forward. And moving forward meant letting go of the need for closure on Sarah's terms. I didn't need to rewrite the past. I needed to live in the present. Mia and I were sitting on a bench by a small pond, the air crisp and fresh with the scent of autumn, when she turned to me with a gentle smile. "You're different," she said, her voice quiet but knowing. I looked at her, wondering if I had somehow given away the thought process that had been swirling in my mind. Different how? There's a peace about you, like, I don't know. You've let go of something, or someone. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. She was right. I had let go of the past, but more than that, I had let go of the fear that had once kept me bound to it. The fear that I would never find happiness again, that I would never be able to trust or love or move forward. That fear had been the heaviest thing I carried for so long, and now it was gone. I guess you could say I've finally let go of the things that were holding me back, I said, my voice steady but with a softness I hadn't expected. Mia took my hand in hers, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "I'm glad you did." For a long time, we sat there, side by side, letting the world move around us while we just existed in the quiet peace of that moment. There were no promises, no expectations, just a shared understanding that this, whatever it was enough. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the pond, I realized how far I had come. I had gone from a place of deep heartbreak and confusion to one where I could finally appreciate the present. I had let the past become what it was, just the past. And in doing so, I had opened up the possibility for something new to grow. I wasn't sure what the future held, whether it would be with Mia, or if life would take us down separate paths. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might come. I knew that, whatever happened, I had found a sense of peace within myself that nothing or no one could take away. And so, the story continued, not with the dramatic highs and lows of the past, but with a quiet, steady rhythm, grounded in the lessons learned and the strength gained through everything I had been through. There was no rush, no need to chase after some grand narrative. Life, in its simplest form, was enough. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. Oshukate. As the days slipped into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found that the steady peace I had worked so hard to cultivate in my life was something I could no longer take for granted. It was a gift, one that demanded careful nurturing, and I was determined to protect it from the storm that could so easily return. There were moments when I caught myself wondering if it would stay forever, or if the unpredictability of life would eventually pull me back into the chaos I had left behind. But even in those moments of doubt, I knew that I was stronger now. I had come so far. Mia and I had become closer, not because of some unspoken pressure or expectation, but because of the quiet understanding that had grown between us. We never rushed into anything. We allowed each other the time and space to continue healing from our pasts, but also to recognize that we had something worth building together. It wasn't about erasing history. It was about embracing it, accepting that we were both scarred, but those scars didn't define us. Instead, they became part of the tapestry we wove together. One evening, as the two of us were cooking dinner in my apartment, laughing about the mishap I'd had with the pasta, which, as usual, had become more of a clump than a dish, I looked at her and realized something. For the first time, I didn't just want this quiet peace I'd found, I wanted her in it. Not as a distraction, not as a temporary fix, but as someone I could see in the long run. Someone who had become an integral part of the life I had so carefully rebuilt. It wasn't an impulsive decision, but a thought that had been growing steadily in my mind for months. I didn't need to rush into anything. We didn't need to rush into anything. But there was something about the way Mia made me feel, something about the calm in her presence, that made me realize that this was something worth investing in. She looked up at me, noticing the shift in my expression, the quiet intensity that had settled over me. "What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle. I hesitated for just a moment before responding, as if I were testing the waters. "I was just thinking. I think I'm ready for more. With you, I mean." She stopped what she was doing, wiping her hands on a towel, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, curiosity, but also something else. "Something warm. I don't want to rush anything either," I continued, "but I've been thinking a lot about how far we've come, how much we've grown, and I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." The air between us grew, still as if the world had paused for a moment to let that sentence sink in. Mia's eyes softened, and then she smiled, a smile that held so much promise, so much tenderness. "I don't want to lose this either," she said quietly. And just like that, we took another small step forward. It wasn't a declaration of forever, not yet, but it was a promise that we were both willing to continue growing together, to see where this slow-burning connection could take us. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and that same unspoken understanding between us. There was no need to make grand promises. We simply let the night unfold as it would, with the unspoken certainty that we were on the same path, moving forward together. As the months passed, that quiet certainty grew. It was no longer about waiting for the past to catch up with us or fearing what the future might bring. It was about living fully in the present, knowing that we had both worked hard to get to this point. Our relationship wasn't defined by the mistakes we had made, the people we had been before. It was defined by the people we had become, the people we were choosing to be in this moment. I never forgot the lessons I had learned during the darker times in my life, the betrayal, the hurt, the quiet struggles, but now they didn't feel like burdens. They felt like reminders of my strength, my resilience. They were part of me, but not the defining parts. I continued to see Sarah from time to time, when the occasional piece of her life popped up in the city, when a mutual friend reached out. But our interactions were always brief, surface level. There was no anger, no bitterness anymore. I had no desire to rehash old wounds. She had her life, and I had mine. It was as simple as that. And then one day, as I walked down the street with Mia, a familiar face appeared in the crowd, Sarah. She looked different, more worn than I remembered. But this time, when our eyes met, there was no tension, no unresolved questions. Just two people who had shared something once and who had moved on. She nodded at me, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and I returned it. There was nothing left to say. As I walked away, my hand in Mia's, the world seemed even quieter, even more peaceful than before. It was a reminder that the past, no matter how painful, no longer had any power over me. The future stretched out before us like an open road, full of possibilities and untold adventures. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to rush toward the end, to look ahead with anxiety or anticipation. I was content to be in the present, to experience each moment with Mia by my side. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't need them. The beauty lay in the uncertainty, in the shared journey we were embarking on. As time passed, Mia and I continued to grow together. Our relationship deepened, evolving naturally from one stage to the next. There were days of quiet contentment, where we simply enjoyed each other's company, cooking dinner together, watching the rain fall outside, or sitting in comfortable silence. But there were also days of laughter, of new experiences, of learning from each other's perspectives and pushing one another to be better. I found myself becoming more open, more vulnerable in ways I hadn't been in years. Mia never pushed me to share, but there was a safety in her presence, a quiet assurance that allowed me to let my guard down. She knew the scars of my past, but she didn't dwell on them. She accepted me as I was, flawed, complicated, and still, healing. And for the first time in a long while, I accepted myself the same way. Occasionally, memories of Sarah would surface, but they no longer had the power to sting. There was a calmness that had settled inside me, a quiet wisdom that recognized the past for what it was, a chapter in my life that had ended. And while it had been painful, it had also been formative, teaching me lessons I could carry with me into the future. I had been shaped by my experiences, but I was not defined by them. Mia and I had begun to talk more seriously about the future, about what we wanted, what we envisioned for our lives together. We never rushed into anything. There was no rush to commit to a label, no pressure to move in together or make any grand gestures. We simply explored the idea of building a life together, piece by piece, as we continued to discover more about each other. One evening, as we sat on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows around the room, Mia turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. I smiled at her, the warmth of the moment settling around us. "All the time, but not in the way I used to," I said. "Before, I was always thinking about what was coming next, what I needed to do to fix things or get ahead. But now I think about it in terms of what we're building together, what kind of life we want to create, not just for ourselves, but for each other." Mia's eyes softened, and she took my hand in hers, her fingers warm and reassuring. "I want to build that life with you," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of both the present and the future. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I know I want it to be with you. In that moment, I realized that the future didn't have to be a grand, mapped-out plan. It didn't have to be a perfect vision or a neatly organized path. The beauty was in the unknown, in the way we could create it together, day by day, step by step. The future was something we would shape together, with patience, love, and an understanding that the only thing that mattered was how we chose to live it. We didn't need a blueprint for happiness. We had each other, and that was enough. And as the days turned into months, and the months into years, I found that this simple truth held the power to sustain me, no matter what challenges life threw our way. We were building something real, something grounded in love, trust, and mutual respect. The past was no longer an anchor weighing us down, but a foundation we stood upon as we reached for the future, hand in hand. There were still moments of uncertainty, of doubt. But I had learned to embrace those moments, to let them pass without allowing them to define my path. Life wasn't always easy, but with Mia by my side, I knew I was capable of facing whatever came next. Together, we had created something, more than just a relationship. We had created a partnership, a life built on understanding, growth, and a shared commitment to the journey ahead. And so, as the years unfolded before us, I realized that the greatest story I had ever lived was the one I was still writing. One filled with love, redemption, and the quiet joy of knowing that the best chapters were yet to come. The years drifted by like leaves carried by a gentle breeze, their quiet passage marked by the soft rhythm of everyday life. Mia and I found ourselves in a comfortable, fulfilling rhythm. We had become experts in the art of simply being together, finding joy in the mundane moments, in the shared silences, and the small, spontaneous conversations that sparked laughter. There was no rush, no pressure to be anything other than who we were in that moment. And it was enough. There were still challenges, of course. Life was never without its complications, its moments of uncertainty. But those challenges no longer seemed insurmountable. We faced them with a quiet strength that came from knowing we could handle whatever came our way. The future wasn't something to fear or obsess over. It was simply a continuation of the present, one that we would navigate together, side by side. At times, I would find myself reflecting on how far I had come. The man I was when I first met Mia seemed like someone else entirely. The anger, the fear, the pain that had once consumed me had been replaced by something steadier, more grounded. I wasn't the same man who had walked through those dark days, wondering if life would ever make sense again. I had become someone who understood that healing wasn't linear, that it wasn't about forgetting the past, but about integrating it into the person you had become. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Mia and I were sitting on the couch, our legs intertwined under a shared blanket. The night outside was dark, the air cool, but inside our little world it was warm and comforting. Mia had her head resting on my shoulder, her fingers tracing gentle patterns on my skin. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked again, her voice soft, as if testing the waters. I smiled, feeling the weight of her question. "All the time," I said, turning my head to look at her. "But now, when I think about it, it's not about the what-ifs anymore. It's more about the what's next. And whatever comes next, I know we'll face it together." She looked up at me, her eyes shining in the dim light. "You know, I used to be afraid of the future," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think about all the things that could go wrong, all the things I couldn't control. But with you, with us, I'm not afraid anymore." My heart swelled with emotion, hearing her speak those words. "I'm not afraid either," I replied, my voice steady. "Not with you." In that moment, I realized that the greatest gift Mia had given me wasn't just her love. It was her belief in our ability to create something lasting, something real. She had helped me see that the future didn't have to be a source of fear or anxiety. It could be a place of possibility, a blank canvas where we could paint the next chapter of our lives. The years continued to unfold, and as they did, the dreams we had began to take shape. We talked about the places we wanted to visit, the adventures we wanted to experience, and the quiet moments we'd share as we grew older together. There was no rush, no urgency. We simply made space for these dreams, nurturing them as we nurtured our love. And then, one day, after a weekend getaway to a small coastal town, as we stood on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mia turned to me with a look that I couldn't quite decipher. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice laced with both uncertainty and excitement. "Of course," I replied, my heart picking up its pace. She paused, as if choosing her words. Carefully. What would you feel about taking that next step? I mean, us. Really committing to the future. Maybe in a way we've never considered before." The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I could do nothing but look at her, letting the weight of her words settle in. It wasn't a question about what we wanted right now, but about what we could have in the years to come. A future not defined by past mistakes or what-ifs, but by the solid foundation we had built together. And then, without thinking, I smiled. The answer had always been there, waiting, ready to spill out. I'd love nothing more than to take that step with you. In that moment, I realized that the journey we had started together wasn't just about finding peace with the past. It was about building something that was uniquely ours. The future wasn't some distant thing that we were waiting for. It was something we had already begun to create, piece by piece, in every small moment of joy, every quiet evening, every shared dream. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I knew that this, whatever came next, was the beginning of something even more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. The story wasn't over yet. It was just beginning, and I was ready to write it, with Mia by my side, every step of the way. As the seasons changed and time carried us forward, our bond deepened in ways that were both surprising and comforting. We found ourselves not just in love, but in partnership, sharing everything, from the smallest moments of daily life to the grand dreams of our future. We had learned the art of listening, of being present, and of knowing that no challenge was too great if we faced it together. The world outside continued to spin, unpredictable and full of its own uncertainties, but we had created a space where we could weather it all. Our home became a reflection of the life we had built, a sanctuary of love, laughter, and the occasional chaos of two people trying to carve out a future. We had our disagreements, our moments of tension, but each one was a chance to learn more about each other, to grow stronger, and to reaffirm our commitment. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the world around us, Mia turned to me, with that familiar look in her eyes, the one that always made my heart skip a beat. She had been quiet for a while, her gaze distant, as if contemplating something deep. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft, "about what we said the other day, about taking that next step. I think it's time." I looked at her, unsure of what she meant, but sensing the weight of her words. "Time for what?" She smiled, her eyes sparkling with excitement and a touch of nervousness. "Time for us to make a real commitment. Not just to each other, but to the future. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think we're ready." It took me a moment to process her words, but when I did, a wave of emotion washed over me. For the first time, I saw beyond the day-to-day, beyond the quiet comfort of our life. I saw the vast expanse of possibilities that stretched before us, and I realized with clarity that I wanted to explore all of it with her. You're right, I said, my voice thick with emotion. We're ready. I'm ready. We didn't need grand gestures, no elaborate plans. It was a quiet moment, a shared understanding that we were not just living in the present, but building something for the future. Our commitment to each other wasn't something that needed to be defined by a single event. It was in the way we showed up for each other every day, in the trust we had cultivated, in the love that had only grown stronger over time. A few weeks later, we found ourselves sitting across from a small table at a local cafe, our fingers intertwined as we discussed the next steps of our life. We had started to talk seriously about marriage, about blending our lives in a way that felt both natural and right. The idea of a future together, forever, seemed less daunting now and more like an exciting new chapter waiting to be written. Do you ever think about the kind of wedding we'd have? Mia asked, her voice light but filled with curiosity. I smiled at her, the thought both exciting and peaceful. I don't need anything extravagant, I said. I just want it to be about us, a celebration of everything we've already built. Her eyes softened, and she nodded. I agree. Something simple, but meaningful. A celebration of us and what we've created. It wasn't long before we began planning, finding a small venue that felt like home, choosing the simplest of flowers, and deciding that we would keep it intimate, surrounded only by those who truly mattered. There was no need for grand displays, no need for anyone's approval. The commitment we were making was to each other, and that was enough. As the day of our wedding arrived, I stood at the altar, my heart beating with a mix of anticipation and peace. Mia walked down the aisle, her presence radiating warmth, her smile brighter than I had ever seen. She was everything I had ever wanted, and more than I had ever dreamed possible. The past was behind us, and the future was ours to create. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had stood by us, I knew that every step we had taken had led us here. When the vows were exchanged, when the promises were made, I knew in my soul that this was where I was meant to be. Not because of some grand plan or fate, but because we had chosen each other day after day with intention and love. And as we shared our first kiss as husband and wife, I felt the weight of everything we had built, everything we had overcome, and everything that was still to come. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the days after our wedding blurred into months, and those months folded into years, Mia and I continued to create a life that was uniquely ours. There were moments of quiet joy, where we reveled in the simple pleasures, a shared cup of coffee. In the morning, the sound of rain on the windowsill at night, the contented silence between us as we read or watched movies together. And there were, of course, moments of challenge, but we faced them not as obstacles, but as opportunities to grow stronger, together. We began to think about what came next, about building a family, about making our mark in the world. It wasn't about rushing to a finish line. It was about savoring each step we took. Whether we were walking hand in hand through a bustling city street or standing together at the edge of a mountain, watching the sun rise over the horizon. One evening, as we sat on our porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mia turned to me, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about everything we've been through, everything we've built, and I feel ready for the next adventure." I looked at her, sensing that there was more to her words. "What kind of adventure?" She smiled, a playful glint in her eye. "What do you think about starting a family?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. My heart gave a small flutter, and for a moment I thought back to all the times I had questioned whether I was capable of building something lasting, something real. But now, sitting there with Mia, with the life we had created, I knew with every fiber of my being that I was ready. We were ready. "I think it sounds like the perfect next step," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I think we've spent so long building this foundation, and now we're ready to share it with someone else. In the months that followed, we began to make plans to prepare ourselves for this new chapter. We talked about what kind of parents we wanted to be, what kind of values we wanted to pass on, and how we would navigate the challenges of parenthood together. There was no rush, no pressure. We were simply enjoying the anticipation, knowing that when the time came, we would be ready. The day we found out we were expecting was one of the happiest of my life. The joy in Mia's eyes as she told me the news, the way she held my hand, as we shared that moment, it was pure magic. It was as if the universe had finally aligned, and everything we had built had led to this one beautiful moment. Over the course of the pregnancy, our lives began to change in ways we hadn't anticipated. There were sleepless nights and morning sickness, but there were also moments of pure wonder, of excitement for the little one growing inside her. We made a promise to each other that no matter how difficult the days might be, we would always support one another, always put our love and commitment at the center of everything. When our child was finally born, I held that tiny, fragile life in my arms and knew that my heart had never been fuller. The joy and love that filled the room were beyond anything I had imagined. We were parents now, creating a new chapter, a new story, a new adventure. As the years went on, I watched our child grow, and I marveled at the way Mia and I continued to evolve as a couple, as parents, as individuals. Our love had deepened, not just for each other, but for the family we had created. We faced the challenges of parenting together, laughing through the chaos, supporting each other through the tough days, and celebrating the small victories that came with raising a child. The story we had started all those years ago, when Mia first entered my life when we began to rebuild after the pain of the past, wasn't a perfect one, but it was ours. It was real. It was a story written with love, with patience, with an understanding that the journey would always be filled with twists and turns, with moments of uncertainty and triumph. And yet, through it all, we had each other. And as I look back on the life we've built, I realize that the greatest adventure wasn't in the future we once imagined, but in the one we created, day by day. The story isn't over yet. It will never be. But as long as we have each other, as long as we continue to choose each other with every new chapter, I know that this is a story worth living. The years passed in a quiet rhythm, woven with laughter, challenges, and the simple joys of watching our child grow. Parenthood brought new dimensions to our lives, exhaustion, overwhelming love, and a depth of responsibility neither of us had fully understood before. Yet through all of it, Mia and I stood together, our bond only strengthening as time carried us forward. Our child, Emma, grew into a bright and curious little girl. She had Mia's eyes, full of warmth and mischief, and an insatiable curiosity about the world. Every day was an adventure, her first steps, her first words, the way she clung to me when she was scared, and how she giggled uncontrollably at Mia's silly voices during bedtime stories. I had once questioned whether I could create a life worth holding on to, but now, as I watched Emma chase fireflies in our backyard, I knew with certainty that I had. As she got older, new challenges arose. School, friendships, the moments where she struggled, and the moments where she triumphed. I had to learn patience in ways I hadn't before, had to remind myself that I couldn't always protect her from the world, only prepare her for it. And through it all, Mia was there, my partner, my equal, my anchor. One evening, as we sat in our living room, Emma fast asleep upstairs, Mia leaned against me, her fingers tracing idle patterns on my arm. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked softly. I smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "All the time." She let out a small sigh, one of contentment. "I used to wonder if we were just surviving, If we were holding on to each other because it was comfortable or because we were afraid of the alternative. But now, I know we were always meant to be here. I looked at her then, at the woman who had become my greatest love, my family, the mother of my child. We built this, Mia. Every moment, every choice. It led us here. And I wouldn't change a single thing. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Neither would I. The years continued their steady march. We grew older, wiser, more grateful for the time we had. Emma blossomed into a young woman, full of dreams and ambitions. One day, she would leave our home to chase those dreams, and Mia and I would find ourselves in a new chapter just as we always had. But I knew, without a doubt, that we would face it together. One afternoon, long after Emma had grown, I found myself standing in our backyard, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. Mia came up beside me, slipping her hand into mine. "Remember, when we used to talk about the future?" she mused. I chuckled. "We spent a lot of time wondering what it would look like." She squeezed my hand. "I think we did okay." I turned to her, my heart full. "Yeah, Mia, we did more than okay." And as we stood there, the weight of time settling around us, I realized that love wasn't about the grand gestures or the perfect moments. It was about the quiet, unwavering presence of someone who chose you every single day. Mia had chosen me. I had chosen her. And in the end, that was the greatest story of all. The seasons turned, and life continued in its steady, inevitable rhythm. Emma grew into an independent, determined young woman. She pursued her passions with the same unshakable drive I had seen in her since she was a child. One day, she packed her bags and left for college, her eyes full of excitement and nervous anticipation. Mia and I stood on the porch, waving as she drove off, the silence that followed feeling heavier than I had expected. "She'll be fine," Mia whispered, slipping her hand into mine. "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was reassuring her or myself. The house felt different after Emma left. Quieter, emptier. It was strange, adjusting to the absence of the little girl who had once filled every corner of our lives with laughter and chaos. But rather than letting the stillness settle into loneliness, Mia and I embraced it as a new beginning. We rediscovered each other in a way we hadn't in years. Without the constant demands of parenthood, we had time to go on spontaneous road trips, time to sit on the porch with a glass of wine and talk late into the night, time to simply exist together without the weight of responsibility pressing down on us. One evening, after dinner, we sat by the fireplace, Mia curled up against me. "You know," she murmured, tracing circles on my arm. "I was scared of this part." I glanced at her. "Scared of what?" "Of us, after Emma left. I thought we might lose ourselves, that maybe we wouldn't know how to be us anymore." I wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "And now?" She smiled, a soft, content smile. "Now I realize that we were never just Emma's parents. We were always us first." I kissed her forehead, letting my lips linger. "We still have so much left to live, Mia." And we did. The years that followed were filled with adventure. We traveled to places we had only dreamed of in our youth, stood beneath foreign stars, walked unfamiliar streets hand in hand. We grew older, yes, but our love remained steady, deepening in ways I hadn't known were possible. Emma graduated, built a life of her own, and one day she brought home a man she loved. Watching her stand before us, happiness shining in her eyes, I felt a pride so deep it brought tears to my eyes. Mia squeezed my hand as we watched Emma dance at her wedding, the same way Mia and I had danced all those years ago. "Do you remember our first dance?" she asked, her voice full of nostalgia. I smiled. How could I forget? You kept stepping on my feet. She gasped, laughing. I did not. You did, I teased, pulling her into my arms. But I didn't care then, and I don't care now. And so, beneath the soft glow of the wedding lights, I led Mia onto the dance floor once more, holding her close, swaying to music that seemed to belong to just the two of us. Years passed, and the world around us continued to change. We became grandparents, watching as a new generation began, seeing pieces of ourselves in the small hands that reached for us. Life, I realized, was never about the big moments alone. It was about the journey, the quiet nights, the shared smiles, the unwavering presence of the one person who had stood by me through it all. And as I sat on our porch one evening, Mia's hand resting in mine, I knew with certainty I had lived a good life, a full life, a life worth remembering, and through it all I had loved, and I had been loved in return. The years continued to slip by, marked by the steady, inevitable passage of time. The world around us changed. Friends grew older, some passing on, while new lives entered the family. Emma gave us 2 grandchildren, little bundles of energy, who brought the same joy and chaos that she had once filled our home with. I saw so much of Mia in them, the same spark, the same boundless curiosity. Mia and I had long since settled into the rhythm of our golden years. We no longer needed grand adventures to feel fulfilled. Our world had shrunk in the best possible way, centering around slow mornings with coffee on the porch, long walks hand in hand, and evenings spent reminiscing about the years behind us. One autumn evening, as we sat watching the sun set over the trees, Mia turned to me, her fingers curling around mine. "Do you ever think about how fast it all went?" she asked. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "All the time." She smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. "We had a good life, didn't we?" I turned to her, searching her face. "We still do, Mia." She let out a soft laugh, resting her head against my shoulder. "You always know just what to say." I pressed a kiss to the top of her head, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair. "Because I've spent my whole life loving you." Mia fell quiet after that, and for a long time we simply sat there, watching the last light of the day fade into the horizon. The final chapter time, for all its beauty, is merciless. Mia grew frailer in the years that followed. It started with little things. Her forgetting where she had left her glasses, losing track of conversations. But soon, the forgetting turned into something deeper, something more worrisome. The doctor called it early-stage dementia. I called it cruel. At first, Mia laughed it off, insisting she was fine, but as the months passed, the disease took more and more from her. Some days, she was sharp and full of life, teasing me the way she always had, sharing old memories as though no time had passed. Other days, I would wake to find her staring at me with confusion, as if I were a stranger in our own home. Those days were the hardest. One night, as I helped her into bed, she reached out and took my hand. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, but the warmth was still there. "I'm scared," she whispered. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Of what, love?" She hesitated, her brows knitting together in frustration. "Of forgetting you. Of losing the pieces of us." I sat beside her, brushing my fingers through her silver-streaked hair. "You could never lose us, Mia. Even if the memories fade, even if the days get confusing, I'll be right here. Always." Her lips trembled as she let out a shaky breath. "Promise me?" I kissed her forehead, my heart aching with a love so deep it hurt. "I promise." And so I became her memory keeper. I told her our story every day, the story of us from the moment we met to the life we built together. Some days, she remembered. Other days, she simply listened, her eyes filling with tears as if she were hearing it for the first time. Even when she no longer knew my name, she still knew me. She still reached for my hand in the middle of the night. She still smiled when I kissed her forehead. She still whispered, "I love you," before she drifted to sleep. And when the day finally came, when she took her last breath in the quiet of our home, her hand resting in mine, I held her close, my heart breaking in a way I had never known before. I sat there for hours, whispering the story of us into the silence, knowing that even if she was gone, the love we shared could never truly fade. Epilogue. A love that never ends, the years after. Mia were quiet. The house felt too big without her, the bed too cold. But I carried her with me in everything I did. I told Emma and the grandchildren stories of her, of the woman who had been my heart, my home, my forever, and as I sat on the porch one final time, feeling the weight of a life well-lived pressing down on me, I closed my eyes and smiled. Because I knew in some way, in some place beyond time, Mia was waiting for me, and when my time came, I would find her again. Just as I always had,